Welcome to today's National Archives Know Your Records program. My name is Andrea Matney, and we are broadcasting live from the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. Most of you here are on site, and others of you are watching from YouTube. Thank you for joining us. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items with you so you know how to participate in today's event. For those of you joining us on site, hopefully you picked up the handout that's available on the table outside. If not, I have some down below, and you can pick those up from me at the end. For those of you who are watching online, you can also get those presentation handouts from our web page. You will have the opportunity to ask questions at the very end of the program. For those of you here on site, if you don't mind using these microphones so that we can pick you up on the video. And for those of you watching on YouTube, you can also ask questions. First, you'll need to log in and then use the chat feature on YouTube. You'll also find on that YouTube webpage a hyperlink to the live captioning. And now I would like to introduce our presenter, John Emond. John Emond retired in 2011 after 30 years in government employ, most of it in various contract, technology transfer, and project management at the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. He currently is a member of the Maritime Committee with Maryland Historical Society. He is an active collector of historical artifacts from the American Revolution and Civil War periods, including several Civil War soldier letters that he will refer to in today's presentation. And now for our presentation, Civil War Voices, Records from the National Archives in a Personal Collection. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our presenter, John Emond.
Thank you very much, Andrea, and I welcome everybody today. I'm glad you were able to join us. As noted in the introduction, I am a collector of Civil War artifacts, and that basically led me here to try to find out more information behind what might be on a soldier's name on a piece of equipment or that person's letter. And in so doing, I really discovered there was a remarkable repository of information that is at the archives here in Washington and also at Archives 2 in College Park. I want to take a moment to highlight a couple of things just to show the magnitude of what the archives provides. The location here in Washington, overall I should say, some general statistics on the archives for both locations. 93,000 motion picture films, over 207,000 sound and video recordings, over 5 million maps, charts, and architectural drawings, 18 million aerial photographs. As far as paper documentation, their repository grows at about 1.4 billion pages per year. And there are genealogy workshops such as the one today to help researchers better understand what they can learn and glean from the archives. As far as the location here, the National Archives created by Congress in 1934 to be the national repository of federal records. And that includes here in Washington a set of really wonderful free access to electronic records, Ancestry.com, Family Search, Fold 3, and Heritage Quest, as well as census records, immigration records, Medal of Honor files, and the area I get mostly involved in, military and pension records, land grants from the American Revolution through the Spanish-American War. At College Park, Archives 2 opened in 1994 to accommodate growing need for archival storage and researcher needs. It also looks at more recent history that has been compiled, post-1900 federal agency records, including Justice, Commerce, Health and Human Services, Transportation, etc. Modern military records, cartographic and architectural files associated with federal agencies, motion picture archives, and still picture archives. This information will be posted online, and also I encourage you that the staff here in Washington and at College Park are most helpful and will certainly be able to aid you if you have any inquiries. So that was just a very quick overview to show what a magnificent repository, national repository, the archives is, both here and in College Park. Now we get to the heart of the talk, Civil War Voices from the National Archives and Personal Collection. The Civil War began even though 7 states had, by April 1861, seceded from the Union. The Civil War began in earnest with the fire and fury of Confederate salvos against Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina, April 12, 1861. And even though there are Confederate armies still in the field, for all intents and purposes, the Civil War ended in the quiet of a farmhouse with Lee's surrender at Appomattox, Virginia, April 9th, 1865. Between the beginning of the war and its end, the cost of war was enormous. On the federal side, the Union side, 2.2 to 2.2 million men served the Union Army, of which about over 100,000 died in battle. 250,000 died of disease. Total casualties, 635,000 men killed and wounded. On the Confederate side, 700,000 to 1 million men served the Confederate Army, of which roughly 94,000 died in battle, 164,000 died of disease, and 100,000 were wounded. These casualties do not take into account all of the many, many thousands of civilian casualties during the war. But just on the military side alone, if you look at the population of the United States in 1860, 31 million free and slave, and you compare that to the population of the United States in 2012, 312 million, a tenfold increase. If you look at the casualties during the Civil War against the overall population, and you compare that to the population in 2012, the casualties in the Civil War would have been the equivalent of 6 million people died in today's figures, or actually in 2012 figures. That gives an idea of the magnitude and how much the war touched so many homes throughout the country, north and south. It is said that battles are planned by generals and fought by privates, and that was certainly the case in the Civil War. Whether you're talking about Union soldiers or Confederate soldiers, they're the ones that bore the brunt of the fighting. They're the ones that really give you an insight into the raw experience of war. What I'll be covering today, in terms of presentation highlights, I'll be going on touching upon the dramatic, the coming storm, a Baltimore letter to friend Bob at the very beginning, just before the war breaks out, December 7th, 1860. Adulation to anger, 2 experiences. A Union soldier from Massachusetts passing through Baltimore in the spring of 1861, and a different Union soldier's journey from Pennsylvania through Baltimore around the same time. Family divided, John Boston. A slave no more. Return to war, James Rorty. Why someone who successfully escaped being a prisoner of war mentions to his parents he's going back into the Army, even though they expressly did not want him to do so. And this letter is explaining to them why he feels compelled to do so. A Confederate view of battle, Kelly's Ford. A Yankees view of battle, Brandy Station, around the same time period in the spring of '63. Historical tidbits from the archives. A request I got for someone to ask me to look into Lincoln's substitute. And I really had no idea that Lincoln had a substitute. I'll go into that. And a small yet remarkable incident that I picked up in my research. Also, I'll be asking you folks, by a show of hands, what would you do? You'll hear a story about evacuating a military post. Should that colonel have evacuated the post or not? I'll give you the details, let you decide. I'll also have a section on prisoners of war. And even though the archives primarily focuses on Union prisoners, many of the things you'll hear today could be just as appropriate, just as applicable to Confederate prisoners in Union camps. And then, amazingly, in the midst of all the carnage and battle, there are some humorous things I came across. Inaction, okay, but you're no Ringo Starr, that'll become very clear later. Hey, Yank, throw it overhand. And the wedding, probably the funniest thing I came across was the wedding, and you'll hear more about that. And then we'll end on the poignant, David King's letter of remorse, probably the most chilling thing I've ever encountered and may ever encounter here at the archives. William Keith, a letter from Appomattox. And then finish up with Wisdom for the Ages, Charles Smith, Reflections and Remembrance, that's as appropriate today as it was when he wrote it in the 19th century. So we start off with the coming storm. A couple of things I want to mention before I go into this letter. South Carolina seceded from the Union December 20th, 1860, which is about 2 weeks after you'll hear about this letter written in Baltimore. You'll also hear a reference to cockades. As the Union was beginning to come apart, tear asunder, those who were sympathetic to the South found furtive ways to express their support. Some would wear cockades. These are round objects, cloth often, that you would pin to a hat, a shirt, or a dress, and you're basically giving the message, I'm for the South. For those who understood the meaning of it, it was very clear what they intended. You'll also hear a reference to a palmetto flag. Before the Confederacy was fully organized, and there was a decision on the design of a national Confederate flag, in the early months of 1861, closing of 1860, beginning of 1861, unofficially, South Carolina's palmetto flag, state flag, was sort of seen as a flag for the South because South Carolina, as I mentioned, seceded in December of 1860. So here's a letter, Baltimore, December 7th, 1860. And with strong ties to the South, bit of background here, Maryland in general, and Baltimore in particular as a border state, experienced growing tension as the nation drifted towards secession and war. Following Abraham Lincoln's election in November of 1860, citizens of Baltimore did not know what the future held, only that life as they knew it would change, and change both dramatically and soon. Here's a letter this individual wrote to a friend, Bob. Dear friend Bob, how are you? Important business claims the attention of everyone, i.e. saving the country, to put down the secessionists here in my state. And by the way, he writes this on December 7th, about 2 weeks before South Carolina secedes. But I believe every hope is gone. Maryland will be as hot for secession as any other state in less than 1 month. The people almost all go for disunion to throw off all northern rule and set up for themselves. As for myself, I am for union so long as old black Abe administers the laws, fugitive slaves to be returned, and so on. But so soon as he shows favor for Negroes, I am for separation and fight to the knife. The boys in Baltimore can fight, as you know from experience, and the Southern Army will be invincible on their own grounds. There is thousands here who are hot for disunion, and they are secretly organizing into companies. So I hear cockades are as plenty as June bugs in July, and the palmetto flags wave from 2 establishments all the time, and at night from several places. Again, this is virtually a Confederate flag before there is an official flag. So a palmetto flag flying in Baltimore basically saying, I'm for the South, I'm for the Confederacy. So you may judge something is in the wind, though I do not know what it is, as I am in the country more than half my time. Yours, George. Then we go into the spring of 1861, and a momentous event took place on April 19th, 1861. Bear in mind that Virginia is right across the Potomac, and Washington was open to invasion by the emergent Confederacy. So they were rushing troops into Washington to hastily erect forts and hastily erect defenses to protect the capital city. Well, the 6th Massachusetts on April 19th, 1861 was coming down from Massachusetts. They stopped in Baltimore. They had to change trains at Pratt Street Station. And in marching from one train station to another, they were met by angry crowds. Bricks were thrown, shots were fired. And at the end of the melee, both civilian and Union soldiers lay dead. It's against this backdrop we have stories of 2 soldiers, one coming from Massachusetts, the other coming from Pennsylvania, both in the spring of 1861. They're passing through Baltimore en route to Washington. At the very beginning of the war, both North and South thought this was going to be a glorious cause. 1 or 2 battles and it'll all be over. There were even some soldiers that were fearful in 1861. They'd be worried that the war would be over before they really got a chance to get into battle and prove their mettle, both North and South. Well, that glorious couple of week or couple of month campaign turned into 4 years of bloodshed. Well, here we have adulation to anger, Massachusetts to Baltimore and Pennsylvania to Baltimore. You see on the left-hand side of the screen, which would be essentially the adulation, you've got marching armies going through, and this could have just as easily been Charleston or Atlanta in the south as it would be Boston or Philadelphia in the north, marching on, having adoring crowds, throwing petals at your feet and really cheering you on. The reality for the Massachusetts unit on April 19th was the opposite. Angry crowds, bricks, and death. Well, here's the story of two soldiers. Adulation to anger. Asa Smith, 16th Massachusetts Infantry, Greenmount Ave, Baltimore, August 20th, 1861. Actually, a little longer than the spring. Dear Mother, here I am in Secession, 43 hours from Boston. From home to Maryland, it was a perfect triumphal march. Your soldier boy got many a sweet kiss from the Jersey girls, good ones too. In Newark, Elizabethtown, Princeton, Trenton, Camden, and all the large places, there was a perfect rush to see us and bring us food and drink. We arrived in Philadelphia at 9 in the evening. They have a place built on the side of the street, and every regiment that passes is fed there. It is a splendid city. The people like soldiers. Thousands flocked to see us, and as in Jersey, old Massachusetts was cheered to the echo. Many a shake of the hand and kiss I got, and a hearty God bless you. We left Philadelphia about 12 o'clock at night for Baltimore. Now the scene changes. About 3 o'clock, the order was, Company K, load. We got into Baltimore yesterday about 11 o'clock and were received without a cheer or other expression. People looked on in sullen silence. We marched through Baltimore and ain't dead yet, and through the most secession part at that. One of Marshal Kane, Police Chief Marshal Kane, one of Marshal Kane's storehouses where powder was hid because there was concern he was actually pro-South as the police force commander. He had storehouses where powder is hid and is used by a commissary to store our bread in. The city is spread out before us. The Washington Monument, as in Baltimore's Washington Monument, you can see to this day. The Washington Monument looks fine. Fort McHenry can be seen directly opposite, about 3 miles from here. Duryee's New York Zouaves are on Federal Hill. Their camp can be seen from here. Fort McHenry was armed in the spring and summer of 1861, not as much from attack from the sea as it would be to put down a rebellion in Baltimore in case further rioting broke out. So it was as much guns trained against the Baltimore citizens as it was looking out to defend the fort. The provost marshal was here and warned us to eat or drink nothing that was given us, as even poisoned peaches are about, a far cry from the food being proffered the soldiers in Philadelphia on their way south. In Baltimore, they're told, don't eat what's around you because it may be poisoned. Another soldier, Sergeant Jacob Winans, Company H, Pennsylvania Reserves, Camp Jackson, Washington, D.C., July 28, 1861. Dear Father, I'm sorry that I've not had time to write sooner, but I've been very busy since I left Pittsburgh. We left Pittsburgh at 8 o'clock. We arrived at Huntington about 5 or 6 o'clock. When we got there, the streets were full of people loaded down with baskets of bread, cakes and pies, buckets of coffee and milk. The whole regiment gave 3 hearty cheers for the good people of Huntington. The cars were ready to take us, cars meaning trains. The cars were ready to take us to Baltimore. I got up in the morning about daylight. I looked out and was admiring the country in Maryland. When we were about 25 miles from Baltimore, we had to wait for some trains from Baltimore. There was a strong guard along all of the railroads. All along the railroad, from the Maryland line to Baltimore, the road is lined with remains of burned out bridges. That was to slow the progress of the Federal Army going through Baltimore. We learned at this place that we would have some trouble in Baltimore, so we were furnished with cartridges, and once again loaded our guns. We got to Baltimore about 1 o'clock. We found things much quieter than we'd expected. We were not molested. Nathan and I took a walk around the city. I found the city to be the most beautiful place that I ever saw. We visited the Washington Monument, again, Baltimore's Washington Monument. It is a splendid column of marble and surrounded by most beautiful grounds. In our travels, we were greeted by, some places by cheers, but mostly as we passed a crowd, somebody would hurrah for Jeff Davis, the newly elected president of the Confederacy, or ask us if we were going to Bull's Run. By July 28, 1861, this is just a few days after the Union fiasco, First Battle of Bull Run, when what was supposed to be an easy victory turned into a crushing defeat for the Union forces. So here you've got Baltimore citizens as 2 Union soldiers are walking by, basically saying, are you on your way to Bull Run, Yank? Basically, are you on your way to get defeated again? I was ordered to form the company as soon as possible to go to Washington. We went to the station. Just before we left, some good Union men came down to the station and kindly furnished us some bread. In going from one station to the other, we marched over the same course that the Massachusetts Regiment did. You see this on the right. That's where the Massachusetts Regiment encountered the rioting in April of 1861. We marched over the same course that the Massachusetts Regiment did when they were attacked. We left Baltimore about 10 o'clock and arrived in Washington about 6 o'clock. Jacob Winans mustered in July of 1861, Sergeant, Company H, 9th Pennsylvania. Term of enlistment was 3 years. He was promoted to lieutenant 1861 and to captain 1863. Mustered out in May of 1864. He was wounded in battle June 30th, 1862 at the Battle of James River. Interesting enough, that was the same battle the other soldier had also been wounded in. Now we move on to John Boston, 81st Ohio Infantry. He writes of a family divided. Clearly, the war literally split families, and I'll tell you about that in a moment. But I want to show you one image from this cartoon. You'll notice the woman has got an apron, and the apron has a design of the Confederate flag, and she's defiantly waving her fist at Uncle Sam. So that's a caricature depiction of a family quarrel. Well, here you have John Boston, 81st Ohio. By the way, I mentioned how it split a number of families. Abraham Lincoln's wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, had several brothers who fought for the Confederacy. In mid-war, there was a Confederate general that was Mary Todd Lincoln's sister's husband who died in the war. Confederate General Jeb Stuart's father-in-law, was a Union officer. So literally, families were split by the war itself. Well, here I have a letter dated November 30th, 1862, from camp at Pulaski, Tennessee. John Boston expresses to his wife his outrage at her pro-Southern father. I think it's a curious thing why your father does not write to you or me. I think that their patriotism is not very strong or something, or else he would write to me. But he don't care one grain if you are dead or alive, and he would rather hear of my death than of my coming home, the cowardly cuss. For he is afraid to hear the cannons roar and the rifles crash for fear that it might break some of his cowardly copperhead bones. Copperheads were individuals that were Southern sympathizers. It might break some of his cowardly copperhead bones. He is mad at me forever, volunteering to serve my country. He would rather hang around the bird's nest. It's probably ye local tavern. He'd rather hang around the bird's nest than leave it to fight, to try and have a good government to protect the family. But let the poor devil go for the time being. But if I should be so lucky as to come home, Leah, I will give him a soldier's blessing, and that will be a rough blessing, you may be sure. While you're away from me and I helping to form a wall between him and the Confederates so that he can sleep unconcerned, but there is a day when he will pay for all of this, if I'm not mistaken. John Boston enlisted October 2nd, 1862 as a private, Company G, 81st Ohio Infantry. He was involved in a number of battles in the Atlantic Campaign, summer of 1864. He mustered out July 13th, 1865, and died August 4th, 1918. So he survived the war. He lived to a good ripe age. That also meant there were some probably very interesting family reunions because he said he was going to give his father-in-law a soldier's blessing, and it's kind of curious as to what he eventually did with his father-in-law, what kind of blessing that father-in-law received. Then a very poignant, a very focal point of the war itself, a slave no more. Several documents in the National Archives recounted individual lives before and after the Emancipation Proclamation. Before the proclamation, their life was referred to as slave time. And I want to take a moment to point out something that's true. I grew up in New England, and at times the history that you can hear becomes slanted depending upon what part of the country you're in. And you know, in New England, they never really, you get the sense of the slavery and equivalent, equal that to the South, and made it very simplistic that it was all associated with the South and slavery. Well, the reality is that in the early years of our country, its founding, slavery was also found in the North. An example would be Josiah Bartlett, signer from New Hampshire. He had owned slaves. Before the war, several Union officers had owned slaves. So it's not just a Southern phenomenon. It was something the North had to grapple with as well over time. I also want to point out that as I've seen in my going through of things like Confederate newspapers, etc., you see slaves referenced in auction as you would cattle, as you would furniture. It became a matter of property. buying and selling. If someone died, they'd bequeath their property to their next of kin, which again could be their household and their slaves. It became a business matter. And you'll see the implications of this business matter in some of the letters. Baptiste Keaton enlisted February 15th, 1864 as a private, U.S. 68th Colored Infantry. He died of disease a short time later in March of 1864. For slaves, there was no respect for the bonds of marriage. As far as Baptiste Keaton, was a slave before the war. After his death in 1864, his widow Mary noted in a deposition that I read here in the archives, my husband was previously married in time of slavery, and his wife was taken from him and sold to a distant land, and he never had heard from her or his child. Another document noted, Baptiste Keaton was married to one Paulina Moon, and her and one child was sold and taken to the Cotton States on or about 15th day of August, 1858. So it's just business. Keep a family together, sell them as a whole, or break them up and sell them separately, depending upon the market, what will bear. It's just business. Anton Williams enlisted February 16, 1864, as a private, U.S. 68th Colored Infantry. Before receiving freedom as a slave, he took the last name of his master, handed from one slave-owning family to another. So his name would change as he was literally handed off from family to family. That about the year 1856, I purchased the said Anton Pratt's of Mrs. Pratt's for one Eliel Donnell, and that he subsequently passed into the possession of Willis Williams, a son-in-law of said Eliel Donnell, and from whom the said Anton Pratt's is thought to have derived his name of Anton Williams. When passed along to Williams, even the Emancipation Proclamation was not enough proof for some former slave owners. This is in the file. I remember Anton Williams, who was a slave belonging to me at the time of the emancipation, and I demanded from the provost marshal the certificate of his enlistment. So it took a recognition that this former slave is now about to enter the Union Army for a slave owner to basically realize, I guess I no longer have control over him. Another document in the file about Anton Williams. Said soldier obtained his freedom a short time previous to enlistment. That he was a slave after he enlisted February 16, 1864. He sent part of his monthly pay to his mother, and the reason why he enlisted under the name of Williams is that was his master's name when he got his freedom, and that he went by the name of his master instead of his own father. And some of you may recollect Malcolm X. Malcolm X had the last name symbolically X, to basically point out that for many individuals, the challenge of genealogy is the fact that it's not a natural heritage, father, mother to son and daughter, etc. It became a matter of transaction from one family to the other of whose property you were. And that's one of the reasons why I think Malcolm X symbolized the disgrace of slavery and how it even took away one's own personal heritage. Charles Buford, even when a slave owner, another point where someone's showing some compassion here, but there's still total control. Even when a slave owner was apparently compassionate and showed caring towards his slaves, including the recognition of marriage between slaves, there was still absolute control. Charles Buford, 68th U.S. Colored Infantry, before the war, while a slave, he and his wife Mary were married at the home of their master, Richard Buford, in Shelby County, Tennessee, in May of 1859. They were married by one of the slaves in the plantation and with the knowledge and consent of their master. They were acknowledged as man and wife by their master and all the others of the plantation. 2 points here then. One, they needed their master's permission to be married. And two, the name is Mary and Charles Buford. As slaves, they had as their last name their master's last name, Buford. The last point on this part of the discussion is the table being turned, Christopher Columbus. Company A, 4th Missouri Infantry. He writes a letter, really rare letter to have someone, letters home in themselves are rare to encounter at the archives. Here's someone, former slave, who had written home, which is extraordinarily rare. Benton Barracks, March 14th, 1864. My dear wife, I like the service first rate. We were assigned to the regiment last week and have been uniformed, and after being drilled, we will be armed and sent into Dixie to hunt rebels. Since I put on Lincoln blue, and you can see a soldier's picture right here, since I put on Lincoln blue, you would hardly know me, your affectionate husband, Christopher Columbus. So you can imagine the gratification of a former slave now in the uniform of the Federal Army, and he's going into Dixie to go after rebels. Talk about the tables being turned. Well, we have other accounts, other reasons why people joined the military. You have a strong Irish-American heritage in the both North and the South. Irish Americans fought for both Confederates and the Union forces. Well, here you've got James Rorty, 69th New York Infantry, 5th Cavalry, and Independent Battery Light Infantry Irish Brigade. There are a number of reasons why people joined the military. At the very beginning of the war, it was the adventure. That quickly soured when the bloodiness of war became very clear. Some tried to just escape the humdrum life at home. Others did it for the bonus they received as they enlisted. Well, here I've got James Rorty that entered service for two reasons. One was, and this is dated November 15th, 1861, and he gave two reasons why he broke his word. Remember I mentioned he was captured, I mentioned at the beginning, he was captured as a POW who escaped, he made it home, and now he's going back into the military even after he had promised his parents he was not going to do that. So he writes a letter explaining why he feels a compulsion to re-enter Union service. November 15th, 1861. Gives two reasons. One is he hated the idea of working in his father's business. God knows I've struggled with both mind and body for 3 years, and at the end I was as far off success as ever and had only succeeded in crippling my intellect and shattering my constitution. I must have some more powerful incentive than the mere prospect of gain. I joined the 69th a shy, morose, and gloomy being, weak in body. After enduring extraordinary fatigue and hardship, I returned. In less than 6 months, my sinews braced and invigorated as if they were turned into iron ones. My nervousness gone. Nothing for curing that like the hiss of rifle or musket balls. As to the danger of death, I always trusted in God's protection. I believe in my heart the dry goods business, hopefully no one here is in the dry goods business. I believe in my heart the dry goods business would be to me a more certain, if not more speedy road to death than a military life is. So it's like, I'd rather face bullets than be behind a counter in the dry goods business. But there's another reason. He's Irish American. And in both North and South, there was a passionate belief, I'm taking my training now, and if I survive this war as an Irish American, I have another agenda. In this case for James Rorty, to use his military training in the cause of Irish freedom. The military knowledge or skill which I may acquire might hereafter be turned to account in the sacred cause of my native land. Sometime before the present unhappy war broke out, I joined the Phoenix Brigade, an organization of Irishmen. I did not then, nor can I now see why I should not make myself competent to lead in the cause of Ireland. Are we not serving the foe of Ireland's foe? In other words, is not the enemy of my enemy my friend? Does not every male bring the cheering indications that the overgrown and bloated commercial body of England will fall like an empty sack if it cannot get the usual supply of American cotton to stuff and bolster it up? The Confederacy had hoped, because England was so dependent upon Southern cotton, that they would recognize the Confederacy, might even militarily join the Confederacy. And that's what he's talking about here, that the Union forces and their efforts to put down the rebellion, also economically to stop the Confederacy from being able to send exports to England. Well, that also hurts England. And as an Irishman, that sounds good to me. It's interesting to know, after the war, former Confederates and former Union Irish Americans joined, a small force joined to invade Canada, to attack the closest British establishment they could get to, and that would be British posts in Canada. So here you have a situation after the war where former Confederates and former Union soldiers united in a common cause to strike a blow against England and for Ireland. Well, he finishes the letter. If what I have urged would obtain your and my dear mother's forgiveness and blessing, again, I promised I would not go back into the military, but I have to break that promise. But I'm asking you to forgive me for that transgression. I would indeed be happy. The consciousness of my disobedience is the only drawback to that happiness. I implore you to give it to me, that I may feel an entire conviction of duty in battle with a light heart. Your affectionate, though undutiful son, James Rorty. Well, I mentioned he enlisted June of 1861 as a private in the New York State Militia, was captured at the Battle of Bull Run in July 21st, 1861. I noted he had escaped from prison in the fall of 61, and he re-enlisted November 17th, 1861, 2 days after he wrote this letter home, begging his parents to forgive him for rejoining the military. And he became a second lieutenant, 5th Irish Brigade, New York Volunteers. He was wounded in the left arm at action at Fredericksburg, Virginia, on December 13th, 1862, but he never had the chance to strike a cause for Ireland's freedom. As Captain 14th New York Independent Battery Light Artillery, he was killed in action at Gettysburg on July 3rd, 1863. Now I want to tell you about two soldier views, eyewitness views of battle. Confederate view of battle, Kelly's Ford, March 17th, 1863. Robert Isbell, 2nd Virginia Cavalry, Rapidan Station, actually a day after the battle. Our cavalry brigade had a considerable fight with the Yankees yesterday on the Rappahannock River, in which our regiment was very badly used up. We had good many wounded and captured. Our major was taken prisoner. He was commanding the regiment at the time the fight took place. I had the misfortune to lose my horse in the first charge. It was shot through the head by a pistol or rifle ball. It fell on the field and died without a struggle. The Yankees were less than 50 yards in front of me when my horse fell. Therefore, I did not have time to save my saddle or any of my clothes. I was shot at a good many times after my horse was killed. One ball took effect in my left boot leg. It broke the skin of my leg a little, but it bruised it very much. I am not at all disabled. All I want is a good horse, and I'll be after the Yanks again. I can't say whether any of my company was lost or not, as my horse fell early in the action. Some of the Appomattox troops were wounded. I came up here last night on the cars, again, on the railroad. I'm staying with Bruman's Battery, your brother Bob. Robert Isbell, born around 1833, enlisted May 13th, 1861, as a first corporal, Company B, 2nd Virginia Cavalry. He was captured, record shows, sick in enemy lines since September 20th, 1862, but then was paroled and back with his company by the end of 62. Wounded in battle, Spotsylvania Courthouse, May 8th, 1864. And the last reference in the file here at the archives is dated November 30th, 1864, when he is ordered to duty from the hospital he's recuperating in. Well, by the end of 1864, the Confederate Army is getting desperate. And it sounds like in this case, even if you were in the hospital recuperating, if you could shoulder a gun, we need you, and we need you now. So he was basically discharged from the hospital in order to go back into his regiment, and that's where the file stops in his history. You've got a Yankee, Union view of battle, Brandy Station, around the same time, the spring of 1863. William Keith, Company A, 8th New York Cavalry. Camp of the 8th Cavalry, Warrenton Junction. Dear mother and father, sisters and brother, I being rested out after a hard fight which we had on the 9th, our regiment was in the advance. We crossed Beverly Ford about 4 o'clock in the morning. As we was crossing the river in the morning, we was ordered to draw sabers. Our Company A and Company B was the first to cross the river. We started our horses on a run as soon as we crossed and commenced yelling like the devil, driving in the Reb pickets. There was a regiment of them drawn up in line. They poured in volley of lead into our ranks, which checked us some. So we returned saber and drew our revolvers and carbines and poured into them. Our company commander, Lieutenant Cutler, was killed, and our Lieutenant Colonel B.F. Davis was killed as we got the Rebs to running and we charging down on them. I never saw such a massing of Rebs in all my life. It was the hardest fighting our regiment ever had. We lost 11 men killed and wounded out of 32 men that was in our company. We had 15 horses killed and wounded. We lost more men than any company in our regiment. I tell you, it was a death struggle for us some of the time. We commenced 4 o'clock in the morning, and we was under fire till 3:30 in the afternoon, when we was drawn from the front and taken from the field. Now we expect to cross again any day. While we was in the field, we suffered for the want of water. The sun forced down very hard. In fact, we had nothing to eat or drink for 24 hours, neither for our horses or ourselves. Their shells bursting on our ranks hurt us more than the bullets. I tell you, I don't want to see any harder fighting again than we had then. But thank God I came out all right, me and my horse. I got the best horse there is in our ranks. A horse that can't run and jump over a rail fence is no good for a cavalryman. From your son and brother, William Keith. Fascinating angle. He's just lived through a horrendous battle. He's seen people to the right and left fall, some die, horses killed, And at the very end of this letter, when he's talking about never wanting to see this kind of horror again, he shifts gears and he's talking about his horse almost like a pet. A cavalryman without a good horse ain't worth nothing. So it's a real juxtaposition of both horror and just pride in having a darn good horse. Then I was asked to do some research for an individual. He asked me to look up Lincoln's substitute, and I never heard about that. Well, by the way, in mid-war, around 1863, both North and South, with all the campaigns and all the fighting, it was no longer a glorious battle, a simple battle, as both sides thought in the spring of 1861. It was a long, drawn-out war of attrition. And to replenish ranks defeated by casualties, Lincoln authorized a draft. And some could readily say the Civil War was a poor man's war, because if you had the available funds, you could buy yourself out of the military. You'd hire a substitute. Well, Lincoln, when he enacted the draft and he authorized the draft, symbolically he wanted to basically show he was no different from any other man. So Lincoln actually had a substitute to represent him in the draft. And that substitute is John Summerfield Staples. John Staples mustered in on November 3rd, 1862 as a private, Company C, 176, Pennsylvania drafted militia. Discharged May 5th, 1863 due to medical disability. Abraham Lincoln signed into law on March 3rd of 1863 a draft that would require military service unless a man hired a substitute. As I mentioned, to symbolically prove he's no better than anybody else, President Lincoln hired John Summerfield Staples to take his place. And in the file here at the archives, you can read about October 1st, 1864, John S. Staples, President Lincoln's representative recruit, was arrayed in the uniform of the United States Army and accompanied by General Fry, Provost Marshal General, Mr. N.D. Larner of the 3rd Ward, and his, meaning Staples' father, was taken to the Executive Mansion where he was received by President Lincoln. General Fry introduced him by saying, "Mr. President, this is the man who is to represent you in the Army for the next year." Mr. Lincoln shook hands with Staples, remarked that he was a good-looking, stout, and healthy-looking man, and believed he would do his duty. Mr. Larner then presented the President with a framed official notice of the fact that he had put in a representative recruit, and the President again shook hands with Staples and expressed the hope that he would be one of the fortunate ones, and the visiting party then retired. I think his chances of being one of the fortunate ones were pretty strong. You've got literally someone symbolically representing Abraham Lincoln. He's not going to be in the Battle of Spotsylvania. He's not going to be in the Battle of Petersburg. He's not going to be anywhere near guns pointed in his direction. I'm sure he was actually, Staples worked for the Provost Marshal until hospitalized for illness and discharged September 12th, 1865, and he died January 11th, 1888. So my guess is once he became Lincoln's substitute, that was the one position anybody in the Army would want, because the greatest danger he probably faced would be the horrific paper cuts. As long as he avoided that, he was going to be just fine. Then I came across another file that somebody had asked me to research, and it sounds too unbelievable to be true, but there's an eyewitness. A remarkable incident at Gettysburg, 2 bullets striking. And this is just a representative example of someone taking aim. But bear in mind the barrel right here. Whilst in the act of firing and at aim, a Confederate bullet entered his musket and met his bullet going out, splitting his musket up to the shoulder, and as the stock rebounded by the shock, struck him on the side of the head. The shock was so severe that he would have fell had I not took hold of him. I was standing by his side at the time and remember the incident well. John Lonergan, late captain, Company A, 13th Vermont Infantry. So I'm not sure if this person is very lucky or very unlucky. He goes to fire his musket, and literally as the bullet is leaving the musket, there's an incoming Confederate bullet meeting in the musket, and the musket basically breaks up, smacks him on the side of the head. Tough day for a soldier. Now I want to engage folks here, and those of you who may be watching this online sort of silently cast your own vote. What would you do, evacuate or not? December 26, 1862, telegraph message from Colonel John Scott, 32nd Iowa Infantry, to Colonel Dyer. I think the post is in no danger. If you have any advice from Cairo or Columbus that indicate an attack on New Madrid, please inform me, as my presence in such an event is desirable. December 27th, next day. Despite Colonel Scott's belief and message that New Madrid, Missouri was in no immediate danger, he receives orders from Brigadier General Thomas A. Davies. Colonel Scott, you will immediately proceed to New Madrid, burn the gun carriages and wooden platforms, and spike the guns, making them inoperable, and destroy the ammunition totally. Take the same boat and proceed to Fort Pillows under cover of gunboats and report to Colonel Wolfe commanding at that place. Thomas A. Davies, Brigadier General. Next day, December 28, 1862, telegraph from Colonel Scott to Brigadier General Carr, St. Louis, Missouri. General, in accordance with orders of the 27th, the day before, from Brigadier General Davies, I this AM abandon this post, having destroyed siege guns and ammunition. I go to Fort Pillow with the command at this place. John Scott, Colonel, 32nd Iowa Infantry, commanding. So he gets an order from a general that, even though he had said originally, I think we're in no danger here, he gets an order from a general. You'll spike the guns, you'll burn whatever you can, you will move your men to another location, to Fort Pillows, under cover. And he does that, and he sends a message to another general that he's carried out these orders. Should he have done that? Should he have evacuated New Madrid? Show of hands, how many think he should have followed his orders and abandoned the post? Okay, most of you are skeptical, like most of you think I've got another thing in my hip pocket. You'd be right. January 6th, 1863, headquarters, St. Louis District, to Colonel John Scott. He's placed under arrest. The Brigadier General commanding directs me to say that as far as he can understand the case, you have abandoned the post in the most shameful and cowardly manner and to the great detriment of the public service. The fact of your receiving orders from General Davies does not palliate in the slightest degree your offense, as you are not under his orders and had no more right to obey his command than he had to give them. The Brigadier General has represented the facts as far as known to Major General Curtis and will prefer formal charges as soon as the data are complete. In addition to abandoning your post, you have deserted the limits of this district with your whole command, and you are hereby ordered to return to New Madrid with your command. Then consider yourself under arrest and turn over your command of your regiment to the next officer in rank, C.H. Dyer, acting as adjutant general. So yes, he obeyed a general's order. He just obeyed the wrong general. Got a feel for the guy. Well, a number of communications go back and forth regarding the charges against Colonel Scott, including two messages that Colonel Scott sends to General Curtis. General, I am in receipt of communication from your headquarters enclosing copy of charges and specifications against me proffered by Brigadier General Carr. Justice to myself and friends compels me to say that every charge and every specification is false. False as hell itself, though I hope less malignant. To Brigadier General Strong regarding a commission's charges against him, its action most probably being final, it is easily seen that I should be either fully exonerated or condemned. If the latter, I will receive the punishment as cheerfully as one may who is not conscious of any offense. In essence, I followed what I thought to be orders from a general. I didn't basically say, shove it, I'm not taking your command, I'm going to wait till I get another command. He followed a general's orders, and as I say, he is a wrong general. Well, ultimately, there was some face-saving. Colonel Scott resigned honorably on May 27, 1864. But it also means that the Union Army loses perhaps a very good commander because of internal bureaucracy where one general issues an order that he had no authority to give. I want to move on to another topic, prisoners of war. This depicts Florence Military Prison, dance at the deadline. And what you see here are images of, in defiance of the deadline, we'll go over that in a moment, you've got prisoners. And by the way, I say the archives here largely focuses on Union prisoners of war and Confederate prisoners. But what the Confederates experienced as well may also equal in horror what the Union prisoners felt. So what you hear now, relative to Union prisoners, may also be considered what some Confederate prisoners went through. So here you've got the deadline. You've got Union, probably at Florence Military Prison, Union prisoners in this depiction dancing along the red line, defying the Confederate guards, being right up against the deadline. Well, these days, if you miss a deadline or you go past a deadline, you might get a reprimand in your file. In the Civil War, at a stockade, whether it's Confederate or Union, you go past a deadline, you're going to be shot. The deadline is quite that, dead line. You go beyond it, those guards you see on top will indeed open fire. And that's why this is kind of a defiance, going right up against the deadline, but not stepping over it. The true horror of Civil War prisons can be seen by eyewitness accounts of the soldiers themselves. The records, as I mentioned, usually about Union, and you'll hear that today, but you can also think just as much about Confederate prisoners. James Byrd, 112th Pennsylvania Infantry. He was captured during what's called the ill-fated mine explosion. They planted in Petersburg a huge set of charges, they dug it right under the Confederates, that blew an enormous hole in the Confederate line. But instead of trying to rush around the perimeter, the Union forces all bunched up in the hole created by the explosion. And it became like a turkey shoot. The Confederates were able to simply fire right down into the Union forces trapped. It was basically a slaughter. And the lucky ones are the ones that were captured, because many of them were just killed on the spot. They were helpless to really not be able to fight back. So here's one that was captured during that mine explosion. Confined in prison at Danville, Virginia, and afterwards taken to Richmond. While confined in rebel prison, we were packed together in large numbers without a change of clothes, without scarcely any food. And during winter of 1865, we were without covering for our bodies at night. Not having any chance to keep our bodies clean or change of clothing, our bodies and clothes were alive with vermin. The windows of the prison were all out, and in the winter of 1865, we were exposed to cold weather. And at night, no bedding of any description had we, compelling us to lay on the hard, bare floor without hardly enough clothes on our backs to cover our nakedness. Our food while in prison was very poor and coarse. 1 pound of cornbread per day was the allowance, it being so coarse that large pieces of cobs often appeared. The bread containing no salt, it would become sour in a few hours and stale. I'm positive no healthy man could be confined in rebel prison 9 or 10 months without having his health undermined. Clarence Wilson, 112th Pennsylvania Infantry. I was captured a prisoner at the same explosion, Burnside's mine explosion in July of 1864, in front of Petersburg in the final charge. I don't think I can begin to draw an imaginary picture strong enough to make you understand or realize one half of torture, of suffering I experienced by stomach trouble and rheumatism while lying in rebel prison. The windows of the prison were all out, and during the winter of 1865, the cold rains, sleet, and snow would come dancing in like an evil spirit, very much to our discomfort. We were thinly clad and were obliged to lay on the hard floor without any covering. A rebel doctor came into the prison twice a week to examine those he called sick. He would walk hastily through the prison, and unless you were nigh unto death, he would not notice you. To flee their desperate situation, some prisoners risked death in daring escape attempts. You hear sometimes, you see in the movies, you hear a reference to release the hounds, and it almost sounds quaint and even caricatured, like in The Simpsons, you've got Mr. Burns, release the hounds. Well, it had a grim reality during the Civil War. Alexander Gibson enlisted February 18th, 1864 as a private, independent battery, Pennsylvania Light Artillery. Captured at Dallas, Georgia on May 26, 1864, he was sent to the infamous prison at Andersonville. Gibson and another prisoner escaped. They were tracked by several hounds and were captured early in the evening. When the hounds got to them, Gibson and his comrade got into a tree, but their captors ordered them down on the ground when the hounds took hold of them. While fighting the hounds, their captors opened fire on Gibson and his comrade with their revolvers. One shot struck Gibson in the left groin, and one shot struck him in the right leg. Gibson was eventually paroled in Savannah, Georgia, November 20th, 1864. I want to end this part of the discussion, the POW part, on actually a rather lighter note. And this is what I would call true chutzpah. Thomas Cummins, Company H, 3rd U.S. Infantry, Company K, 8th Texas Infantry, Confederate. Thomas Cummins, who on oath says at the beginning of the present war between the United States and the Confederate States, he was a private in Company H, 3rd United States Infantry, and that he quit said service and attached himself to the Army of the Confederate States. That at the time he quit said service, the United States government was indebted to him in the sum of $110 for military services rendered, that said sum or any part thereof has ever means never been paid to him up to this time. Confederate States to Thomas Cummins, for services rendered in Company K, 3rd United States Infantry, previous to his joining the Army of the Confederate States, which indebtedness was promised should be paid by Major General Van Dorn, Confederate General Van Dorn, $110. I certify on honor that the above account is correct and just, that the services were rendered as stated, and that they were necessary for the public service. Signed by Quartermaster. Received at Galveston, Texas, the 10th of January, 1864, of Major Thompson Harrison, Chief Paymaster. $110 and no cents in full of the above amount, signed by Thomas Cummins. Anybody see something kind of strange with this? Anybody? Well, let me paraphrase. As a soldier, he's captured. At the time he was captured, the federal government owed him back pay. So then he goes to the Confederates and he goes, yeah, I want to join up with you folks. And on top of that, yeah, I kind of would like to get back pay. So you can imagine the Confederates going, let me get this right, Yank. You as a Union guy were kind of paid to kill us, Confederates, and your government didn't pay you. So now you're coming to us and you want us to pay you for services you rendered trying to kill us. You want back pay from the federal government that we should pay you? And they did. Okay by us, sure, we'll pay you. Unbelievable. That's why I call it chutzpah, where he actually gets from the Confederates back pay rendered when he was a Union soldier. Gotta love it, the guy had guts. I'm moving now into definitely the humorous part of the overall discussion. You heard a little bit of it then. Well, here you've got Lieutenant William Hepburn in action. And as you see by the barrel there, the guy is basically walking around in a whiskey barrel, so you can imagine what the offense is. Well, here you've got Lieutenant Colonel William Hepburn. He was court-martialed for being drunk on duty as follows. William Hepburn, Lieutenant Colonel, 2nd Iowa Cavalry, on or about the 3rd day of November 1863, during the engagement with the enemy in Tennessee, was then and there drunk to such a degree as to render him totally unfit to command. He was so drunk that he ordered Lieutenant Perry Reed, commanding 2 12-pound howitzers at 2 different times to fire said guns, when said fire would have resulted in the destruction of a column of lead horses in front of said guns, and 2 companies of men deployed in front of them skirmishing with the enemy. In other words, he's told his subordinate to open fire on his own men. Later on, it even gets better. On or about the 3rd day of November 1863, Lieutenant Colonel William Hepburn, commanding the regiment, then in pursuit of the enemy, was so drunk that he ordered 2nd Lieutenant Perry Reed, commanding 2 12-pound howitzers, the same cannons, to shell a flock of goats, which said order was carried out and obeyed. So the subordinate obviously didn't fire on his own men, but he did carry out the order to fire on the goats. And I can imagine the subordinate going, but sir, those are goats. And the commanding officer, being rather tipsy, going, damn it, man, I gave you an order, fire. And the goats put to flee. So we didn't capture or kill any Confederates that day, but we definitely put the fear of God in those goats. Now we have, as I referenced at the beginning of the talk, okay, but you're no Ringo Starr. Colonel Lewis B. Pierce, 12th Pennsylvania Cavalry. He had a very checkered career with multiple charges leveled against him in the course of his service. One would be bribery in exchange for promotions. So if you want to be a captain, it's going to cost you. If you want to be a major, it's going to cost you some more. Also for conduct unbecoming an officer. Well, on October 28, 1863, Colonel Pierce did, and this is around 11 o'clock at night, did when in a drunken condition ride a horse furiously into the camp of the 116th Ohio Volunteer Infantry and demand of Major Harris commanding 2 snare drums, one for himself and one for a captain then with him, saying, "There's a bet between us concerning who's the better drummer," hence Ringo Starr. The major protested against drumming in the camp at so late in time. Colonel Pierce said in reply, "I'll be responsible. Let me have the drums. Your men ought to learn to fall out after night any hour." He, Colonel Pierce, did beat the long roll, causing a false alarm in the camp and quarters and among the pickets stationed in and about Martinsburg, Virginia. So bottom line, it's 11 o'clock at night, you're in your tent, and you hear the long roll. That's basically a drum alarm, basically saying, we're under attack. They come charging out of their tents. The pickets are probably looking all directions, trying to see where the Confederates are coming towards them as pickets. They are the ones on the front line. It's their firing back that's going to alert where the Confederates are heading. So you get all this going on. The camp's in a complete uproar just because this one guy, basically this colonel, has a bet with a subordinate on who's the better drummer. Sadly, the archives file doesn't really indicate who won the bet. But Colonel Pierce was eventually, by the way, sometimes if officers resign for pressing family matters or business reasons, the reality is they're about to be booted out. Well, this guy is so good. He is such a sterling individual. There's no fluff on the reason why he is to be escorted out of the military. Colonel Pierce was eventually removed from his position due to utter worthlessness and inefficiency, as noted in one general orders, and incompetency, as noted in another general orders document. So there's no attempt to cover up and say, oh, he's got pressing family matters. No, the guy's a buffoon. We really need to get rid of him for the sake of the Army. We also have, because we're both Americans, North and South, a common heritage. It was hard for officers to keep Confederates and Union from having some interchange in the quiet times between battles. There was a lot of interaction going on, whether it's Confederates exchanging tobacco for Union soldier coffee or exchanging papers to get an idea of how the other side's viewing the war. Despite officers' attempts to really stop that, there was this sort of informal truce that would occur during a quiet moment. Well, here we have a passage from a Confederate. Camp Stonewall Brigade, Orange County, Virginia. Dear sister, yours of the 13th come to hand. This is Ambrose Height, Company H, 33, Virginia Infantry. Dear sister, yours of the 13th come to hand on the 29th of December. Your letter found me well and hearty. I'll now give you what little news I have. The day is a pleasant day for the time of year. We have taken up winter quarters at last. We have camped 7 miles below Orange County Courthouse on the old Fredericksburg Road. Our brigade was on the outpost on Christmas Day. I and 6 others and the captain was on one post together. After we was on post about 15 minutes, there was a Yankee come to the river, and we exchanged papers with them. We throwed the paper across the river with a rock. The first paper that the Yankee tried to throw across fell short about middle ways of the river. So like, try on overhand. Well, then the boys told the Yankee to take off his overcoat or else he would not get that one across. So he'd taken off his overcoat and throw it across the river. The Yankee then went back, your brother A.M. Height. So let's recap this exchange. Both sides are exchanging newspapers. The Confederates are adding with the newspaper a rock to help it go across the river. So the Yankees get a newspaper and a rock. The Confederates tell the Yankee, take off your overcoat, that way you'll get across the river. So in exchange for a rock, the Confederates get a winter overcoat. Guess who won the better barter in that arrangement? Well, Private Ambrose Height mustered in April 8, 1862. He was captured May 12, 1864, during the brutal Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse. He was sent to a POW camp at Fort Delaware, and he took the oath of allegiance at war's end on June 20th, 1865. And probably the funniest thing I came across, again, at the archives here, was a passage that relates to a wedding, sort of. This is a woman that sent in a pension. Her husband died, and she sent in a pension request. And the pension official basically says, there's something screwy with your name. What's with the background of your paperwork? Well, she then has to admit to the individual, while about 19 years of age and unmarried, she attended a mock marriage. And while there, they all decided to have a mock marriage as a part of the amusement. That she was chosen to act as bride, and one Thomas Dawson to act as groom. No one present intending it as a marriage in fact. The groom so selected was a comparative stranger to her at the time, that in connection with this act of fun they went through with the ceremony of marriage. And I likened it, if you remember the old Seinfeld series, and you liken it to Kramer as perhaps the minister. So this woman who hardly knows this guy, they're going through this marriage ceremony as part of the party, kind of living it up and then just having a good old time. Well, that's soon after, and before the breaking of the party, she was informed that the person officiating as the minister was in fact an ordained minister and authorized to solemnize marriages. So think of someone like a Kramer character coming up and saying, "You're going to love this. I'm a real minister and you're really married." She immediately, upon being informed that the ceremony was in fact a marriage, said to the groom, Thomas Dawson, "You know this is not intended to be a marriage, and I want you to take immediate steps to make it annulled by divorce or otherwise." Well, being very much embarrassed and humiliated by the affair and acting impulsively, she assumed a fictitious last name of Frost and continued to pass as Alice Frost and was married to Mortimer Flint, upon whose service she bases her claim for pension as Alice Frost, her real name, her maiden name, having been, in fact, Abby Trowbridge. So, it sort of likens it to modern day someone in Vegas waking up and remembering that, vaguely recollect being married by Elvis and feeling very anxious about that. Well, that was, Victorian version of that. As we now are winding down the talk, I want to get back onto a very poignant note. I mentioned at the beginning of the talk coming across something that's the most chilling document I've ever encountered and may ever encounter. I want to take a quick sidebar note. Right now, the archives is in the process of digitizing the records, and I think that's absolutely spectacular and absolutely needed, because even some of you who are staff here know that the records are getting very frail. Even if someone's delicately trying to handle them, they will tear, they will get damaged. And in order to disseminate it to a wider audience than those who can get here to this Maryland and DC, digitizing really makes it available to all. But I hope the archives never completely puts up a barrier to prevent people, maybe on a special request, to actually get to the source. I say that because when I was doing research on a David King, I actually came across his letter, not a file reference, not something digitized, his letter. And this is why it was so chilling and so powerful. David King, first off, enlisted military service early in the Civil War, mustering in on September 2nd, 1861, an important date to remember, as a Corporal Company E, 3rd Regiment, Michigan Cavalry. His term of service was 3 years. He re-enlisted on January 27th, 1864, at the rank of sergeant. So he writes a letter home on September 1st, 1864, from camp at Brownsville Station, Arkansas. I had requested the file on him. You never know what's going to be in the file until you get it. I came across his actual letter in his handwriting with the envelope. And in part of his letter, he says, "Dear parents and friends, I'll try and write a few lines to you. I spoke in my last about the rebel raid on the prairie. They captured some 400 or 500 prisoners. Our men are after them yet. It is 3 years tomorrow." He's writing September 1st, 1864. He enlisted September 2nd, 1861. "It is 3 years tomorrow since I first enlisted. And if I hadn't been such a fool as to enlist again, I might be at home in a short time. Don't say anything about this last sentence that I've written, or say anything about it if you please. Virgil," presumably his brother, "Virgil can do as he thinks best about enlisting. If he wants to enlist, for he had better go as a substitute, being paid, for some man that would pay a large price. Father, if you think he is of any use to you, keep him. So if at all you can keep him in your business or keep him on your farm, keep him out of harm's way. But otherwise, Virgil, if you're going to fight, if you're going to put your life on the line, do it as a substitute, at least be paid a decent wage for doing so." So he writes that on September 2nd, September 2nd, 1864. Military service records at the archives note, I'm sorry, he wrote it September 1st, 1864. Military service records at the National Archives note David King was captured by guerrillas near Brownsville Station, the same place he wrote from, on September 4th, 1864, 3 days after he wrote the letter I was holding in my hand. One record at the archives indicates, after referencing being captured by guerrillas on September 4th, no further information after September 4th. Another record in the archives cites the date of King's death, September 4th, 1864, 3 days after he wrote this letter. I mentioned the letter comes with an envelope that he used to mail it. That envelope is dated September 5th, 1864. By the time that envelope is stamped and en route to the family, he's already dead. And in that letter, he had expressed, if he hadn't been such a fool, he'd be on his way home by now. Well, in the file, years later, there's a letter from King's father in 1887 to another of King's brothers. And his father reflects on King's last letter, the one that I was holding. And he indicates there is one thing in there he did not want mentioned. You will see what it is. And that's the reference. It's been 3 years since I enlisted. If I hadn't re-enlisted, I'd be on my way home now. And literally and presumably the letter that King's father is referring to, or the regret on re-enlisting, is the decision by re-enlisting that literally cost him his life. There are other times, I've gone through a record where this woman had 5 sons that were in the military. And you go on through the file, and you realize that 2 of them die in battle, 2 more die of disease. And even though everybody involved in this is long since gone, as you're going through the file, you're thinking, my God, the entire family is disappearing. And you sort of reach beyond the years to the family, and you feel touched by their pain, even though they're long since gone, just knowing what a horrific endurance that family went through. So there are times when these letters can actually, it's like looking over the shoulder of history. You really have a sense of what it's like living what they lived through. Well, as we wind down now, the last reference that's wartime is William Keith. The war is basically at an end when General Lee surrenders at Appomattox. As I mentioned at the beginning, there are still Confederate armies in the field. But for all intents and purposes, when General Lee surrenders at Appomattox, for all intents and purposes, the Confederacy is done. So William Keith is writing on April 15th, 1865. And by this point in time, Lee had to, just before the surrender, had to abandon the defensive works in Petersburg. And he had to notify Jeff Davis in Richmond he could no longer hold the line against General Grant's forces. So they abandoned Richmond. Lee heads south through Virginia trying to link up with Joe Johnston. And then he encounters Union forces in front of him and other Union forces in back of him. There are several clashes that took place. He loses many men, he loses commanding officers, and he realizes at Appomattox that additional resistance is only going to slaughter the remaining men in his army. So with great reluctance and sorrow, he surrenders April 9th, 1865. And William Keith was there to watch this, and he writes home. Camp at Appomattox Courthouse, April 15th, 1865. Dear mother and father and sister, I have the pleasure of writing you once more after days of hard marching and fighting, and I feel to thank God I am thus spared. Well, mother, I have the pleasure of telling you that I think we have fought our last battle. Since I last wrote you, I have experienced hard times from the 1st of April. Our division, under the command of our brave General Custer, George Armstrong Custer, charged the Reb breastworks near the South Side Road and gained it with the assistance of the 5th Corps. We hunted and drove the Rebs out of their holes that they were lying in for most of a year. Our regiment was in the advance of our division, was deployed as skirmishers, and drove the Red skirmishers back to Lee. They sent up a flag of truce about 8:30 o'clock, and such shouts and yells went up from our men, this made the ground shake. Mother, I could not believe my own eyes. My blood ran cold in my veins with joy to stand and look down upon them. Rebs that we have been struggling and fighting with for the past 4 years. I can't express my feelings. I think we have fought our last battle. I trust so. Your son, William Keith. I want to conclude my talk today with another thing that I found at the archives, and this is Wisdom for the Ages, Charles Otto Smith. He was a soldier, Company G, 102nd Ohio Infantry. He was born April 1st, 1846, and was a clerk before the war. Charles Smith entered military service February 23rd, 1864 as a private in the 102nd Ohio Infantry. His term of service was 3 years, transferred at war's end to Company F, 189th Ohio. He mustered out of service on September 28th, 1865, and he died January 11th, 1919. Well, one of his roles after the war was that of patriotic instructor, Department of Pennsylvania, GAR Soldiers Memorial Hall, Pittsburgh. And it's in that capacity he puts forth, and again, this is in the file. You could see it to this day, a sermon, if you will, to his comrades and to others that is as meaningful today as it was when it was written in the 19th century, entitled, Remember, do not keep the alabaster boxes of your love and tenderness sealed up until your friends are dead. Fill their lives with sweetness. Speak approving and cheering words while their ears can hear them, while their hearts can be thrilled and made happier by them. The kind words you mean to say when they are gone, say before they go. The flowers you mean to send for their coffins, send to brighten and sweeten their homes before they leave them. If my friends have alabaster boxes laid away full of fragrant perfumes of sympathy and affection, which they intend to break over my dead body, I would rather they would bring them out in my weary and troubled hours and open them, that I may be refreshed and cheered by them while I need them. I would rather have a plain coffin without a flower, a funeral without an eulogy, than a life without sweetness of love and sympathy. Let us learn to anoint our friends beforehand for their burial. Post-mortem kindness does not cheer the troubled spirit. Flowers in the coffin cast no fragrance backward over life's weary way. Remember, we travel the road of life but once. Let us try to make the world better for having lived. And I think there's no better note to basically conclude my talk than on that note. So I want to thank you very much for being here, and I'm glad to open this up for any questions.
Thank you very much, John. At this time, I don't have any questions from our online audience. While folks are lining up to ask questions at the microphones, I have my own question. Some of these are obviously from your personal collection and many from the National Archives. Was there, could you help the rest of us find these records? Are there particular record groups that we should look at?
It's interesting, when people ask me for research support, a lot of times they'll say, I just want the military records, I really don't want the pension records. It sounds like there's just a lot of stuff that might not be of interest. And I always encourage people to get the pension records, because you never know what's there in the pension side of it. I have come across photographs of individuals, either around the time of their wartime service, or as an obituary notice, you see a photograph of them. And these letters that I refer to that are at the archives, at times a soldier has sent money home to the family. And if the soldier dies in battle and the family's seeking a survivor pension, to prove that they relied on the soldier's money home for their survival, they sent the actual letter to the pension office, and then it actually got to the archives. That's how it ended up in the pension records. So I'd say a lot of times it's hit or miss. There are a lot of files that are sort of interesting but not exemplary. Other files are incredible. But I would say those remarkable instances really surface in the pension side of it. The military is always good to have. It puts in context where they were, what battles they fought in, et cetera. But then there are some insights that can be gleaned at times by the pension as well. So military and pension records can both yield amazing stories.
Thank you very much. We'll have a question from our on-site audience. Go ahead, sir.
Okay, well, I do have one comment initially. I didn't know about the Lincoln substitute, but that was obviously a total publicity stunt since the Union Army draft was only for men aged 20 to 45, and Lincoln was age 54 at the time. So even if he wasn't president, he wouldn't have been subject to the draft.
That's true. I think what he was trying to do, though, because he was the one that initiated and authorized it, I think he was trying to symbolically, and even if he was a much younger man, clearly, as I mentioned in the presentation, Lincoln's substitute was not going to be anywhere near being captured or in harm's way. But I think he felt a sort of moral obligation to say, even as president, I'm no different from anybody else, and I'm hiring a substitute so that if I do that, hopefully others can also follow suit. And he was trying to lead by example, even though you're right, he would have been
Very
too old.
typical Lincoln.
So,
Probably the most famous Civil War. First of all, I noticed that most of what you refer to are from enlisted men rather than officers. You feel you can get better feeling for the day-to-day from the
I think so.
men?
In terms of what I encountered, although occasionally you see lower level, I referenced lieutenants or captains, et cetera. But for the most part, the kinds of files that I've found on request have tended to be for the enlisted men. A lot of times other collectors will approach me, and a lot of people don't have a general's sash or a general's engraved sword, but they might have a musket that was carried by an enlisted man. So a lot of the times people that approach me for research support, it's because they're interested either in a family ancestor or in an artifact they want more information on. And there are not that many instances where someone had a direct linkage or in their possession of something that was carried by upper staff officer.
Just a general question. Probably the most famous Civil War letter, and to me the most moving, is from Ken Burns, the Sullivan Blue letter. Is that here in the archives, that letter? Or
Could very well be. Actually, someone from the staff is mentioning you've not seen it, or?
The original letter is long gone.
Is it?
Okay.
Long gone. I think it exists in copies of the original letter, which, by the way, I understand was never actually mailed. Is that right? It doesn't exist.
So for those who are online, the question was, is that letter of the soldier Ballou?
Sullivan Blue,
Sullivan
Major
Blue.
Sullivan Blue, yeah.
Does that letter, is it still found within the archives? And there's a gentleman from the audience basically indicated that that letter no longer exists. It's no longer extant. The letter I mentioned about a soldier's regret of David King, I can guarantee you, because it was only about 6 months ago, I still pulled it to see if it's still in the file. Indeed, that letter with its processed envelope was still in the file. So that one absolutely was mailed.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you. Interesting comment. Do we have any more questions from our audience? I don't see any more online, so thank you, John. I also would like to thank our captioner today, Cindy Hines, and our audiovisual staff, and thank you everyone for attending today's presentation. Please know that the presentation video recording and slides will remain available on this YouTube webpage. On behalf of the National Archives and our presenter, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.